Great rising, grasshoppers. My name is Mrs. Maadi Tanetter, and I am a social studies teacher at Denton Magnet. Now, I'm going to bring you the lesson today for Social Studies 6. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that she called us grasshoppers? This is why. Before I became a middle school teacher, I used to teach 3rd grade. And I would read to them chapter books. And one of the chapter books that I would read would be James and the Giant Peach. And one of the characters was the grasshopper. And he, in my opinion, was the wisest. And that is what I charge all of my students to be. Be wise in your thoughts, be wise in your actions. So, once again, grand rising grasshoppers. Let's get into the lesson. Now, the lesson that we are going to be doing is the civil rights movement. This is from chapter 13 in our social studies book for Mobile County Public School System. Before we get into it, though, here's what I want you to think about for a second. Let us pretend that you are an African American student in the 1950s. You get up early every day and take long bus rides across the city to an African American public school. There is another school just 3 blocks from your home, but only white students are welcome there. You have heard, however, that this school will soon be opening its doors to black students as well. Would you want to be one of the first African American Americans to attend this school? Why or why not? That's just something that, needs to be thought about. Some of you all might say, yeah, I want to be first because it's close to my house. And some of you might say, maybe not, because it's kind of scary being first. It really is. It takes courage to be first. Not to mention, everybody's not going to be okay with this. So, and some of you all might be like, well, I don't know. It might be a good thing. It might not be a good thing. But there were some students who had to go ahead and show their bravery. Being courageous does not mean you have no fear. It just means that you recognize your fear, but you do what must be done anyway. So, if you have this packet, please, ma'am, please, sir, go ahead and get it out. It's going to say the Civil Rights Movement at the top, and we're going to be looking at section 1. There are 3 pages. Now, you can print this off of the school system website, and if you just want to listen, that's fine, because this is going to be tape recorded, and you can look at it a little bit later on MCP SSTV or on YouTube. So whatever it is you want to do, but if you have the packet and you want to follow along, go ahead and get it. You need a highlighter, a pen, or a pencil, something to that degree. We good? We good. All right, so the 2 standards that we're going to be looking at are these. Number 9, critique major and social cultural changes in the United States since World War II. And number 12, recognize domestic issues that shaped the United States since World War II. Now, when we say domestic, we mean anything that's going on inside of the country. And I also want you to remember that stuff like this was going on throughout the country, not just in, pockets all over the country. It's just that this section is only going to focus on specific events that made national headlines. Are we good? All right. So, our key terms, we've got 8 of them. The first one is Thurgood Marshall. He is an attorney, or was, I should say, and the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark lawsuit that challenged the segregation of public schools. The Little Rock Nine, the first black students to attend a school forced to integrate in Little Rock, Arkansas. Rosa Parks, African-American woman who refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white passenger. The next 4, the Montgomery bus boycott. nonviolent protest of segregation in public transportation. And this happened in Montgomery, Alabama, about 2 hours from where we are northeast. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader who inspired nonviolent protests against discrimination, sit-ins, demonstration in which protesters sit down and refuse to leave, and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the student activists who organize nonviolent civil rights protests and voter registration drives. So those are your key terms. Our essential question is right here. And the name of our section for section 1 is this: the civil rights movement takes shape. How did Americans respond to discrimination during the civil rights movement? Now, the two ways that this particular section focuses on is through the courts and through public protest. Now, you see these people right here. We have Thurgood Marshall, we have Rosa Parks, and we have Dr. Martin Luther King. And in this lower picture down here, I don't know if you can see it because of our sign language person, but we have our Little Rock 9 trying to enter Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. These people are going to be talked about in this section. So go ahead, make sure that you're annotating, or if you want to catch this later, that's fine too. But we're going to go ahead and move ahead. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, well, how did this even come about? Why were public facilities separated in the first place? Well, let me back up just a little bit. Directly after the Civil War, which was about 1865, in that particular time period, for a short time, people of different colors, they just kind of mingled wherever. Until about the 1880s, when we had this particular ruling where governments could go ahead and separate the public facilities. Now, this man by the name of Homer Plessy, here he is right here, he caught a train going from New Orleans to another area of the state. Now, because at that time public transportation was separated, he was arrested because he would not, he sat in the wrong area of this train. Now, he took his court to, he sued the train company, and at that particular time, his argument was this: my 14th Amendment is being violated. Now, I want you to keep that 14th Amendment in mind, because we are going to come back to that. But at that time in 1896, the Supreme Court basically said, no, that only applies to your civil rights. It doesn't apply to, your right to sit to where you want to sit to. So anyway, in 1896, the Supreme Court said that federal, state, and local governments could allow segregation as long as the separate public facilities were equal. And this was the beginning of kind of an ugly period in our country's history and it ushered in these things called the Jim Crow laws. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but what I do want you to do is in your spare time, Google it, or what I would tell my grasshoppers, it's Googleable. You can find it. So from about 1896 all the way up until the 1950s, we had these separate but equal laws in place. And that trickled down from hospitals to restaurants to the military, and it also trickled down to the schools. Now, the problem with this separate but equal doctrine is this. Yes, the schools were separated. We had white schools, we had black schools. The problem was that they were not equal. And typically, the black schools would not get as much funding as our white schools, unfortunately. So that's where that came about. Now, I mentioned the 14th Amendment. That is part of our Constitution. And the 14th Amendment states that citizens should be equally protected under the law. That's going to be important, because when we get into the Brown versus Board of Education, that amendment is going to pop up. Now, this particular map shows how schools were segregated prior to Brown versus Board of Education. Now, if you look at this map, Just like with all maps, there is a key, and our key is down here. Anything that is in salmon pink, those particular school systems had a mandatory segregation law in place. The schools that were in light blue had an optional segregation policy, which means that the school system could choose. And anything that was gray did not have segregation. It was considered forbidden. And anything that was lavender, no school segregation legislation. So let's go back to our map skills real quick. North, south, east, west, because we don't have a compass rose here, all right? Those are our primary directions. So if we remember our compass rose, where is the state of Alabama? Would you consider it the north, the south, the east, or the west? If you chose south, more specifically southeast, that's an intermediate direction, you were correct. So here we are, state of Alabama. Now, according to our key, at this particular time, and this is in the 1950s, Alabama had mandatory segregation. Now, the court case of Brown versus Board of Education happened in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. Now, Kansas, according to this map, is blue. So what kind of segregation policy did Kansas have at the time? If you chose optional segregation, you have some boss map skills. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So anyway, here we are in Topeka, Kansas. Now, remember I said the 14th Amendment? Remember it. This particular gentleman, Thurgood Marshall, was one of the lawyers that took this particular case to the Supreme Court. Now, let me tell you a little something about Thurgood Marshall. When he was in school, he was, let's see, the best way I can describe him is loquacious. Loquacious is a big fancy word that means he liked to talk. Do you know somebody like that? Mm-hmm. Now, what ended up happening with him is this. He would get sent to the principal's office. Now, the principal would not suspend him or, put him in ISS or what have you. This is what he did. The principal would give him a copy of the Constitution to read with all of these amendments, including the 14th one, where every citizen that was born or naturalized in the country was obligated to equal protection under the law. That's the 14th Amendment. Now, because he liked to talk a lot, he got sent to the principal's office a lot. And he was given the Constitution a lot. So what happens if you read something over and over and over and over and over and over and over again? You're going to remember it. That's called studying, but that's our secret, okay? But anyway, he ended up memorizing the whole Constitution. So I guess he liked to talk, which is good because he eventually became a lawyer. You might know somebody like that in your classroom. They might be speaking to a Supreme Court justice later on in life. But anyway, Brown versus Board of Education. This happened because of a little girl by the name of Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas. Her dad wanted to register her in a school that was right down the street from their house, but it happened to have been a white school. She was forced to go across town to go to an African-American school. Well, her dad, along with a couple of other families, got together and filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education. And the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, got involved. Now, let me back up just a little bit. At this particular time, the term colored was used to describe black people. We don't hear that too much anymore, but that was the terminology at the time. Nowadays, when you see NAACP, the C turned from colored to concerned. So that's an aside. Anyway, this organization's strategy was to show that the schools were separate, but they were not equal. Remember, I did say that typically the black schools did not get as much funding as the white schools, unfortunately, and they wanted to show this. Now, the attorney at the time, or lawyer, for the NAACP was Thurgood Marshall. And he argued under the 14th Amendment, these students or these babies are citizens of the United States. And because they are citizens of the United States, they should have the same equal protection under the law. Now, he didn't say it quite like that, but that's what he said. And as a result, the Supreme Court ruled on May 17th, 1954, that segregation of public schools was illegal. And you need to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And that's basically what had happened. Now, change is inevitable, but that doesn't mean that's going to be easy, and everybody's not going to be cool with it. Here we have the Little Rock Nine. We are in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, the school board had decided to start integrating the schools soon. And they started doing it little by little. And they took these 9 babies, and I'm sorry, all students are babies to me. They took these 9 babies and decided we're going to start with Central High School. Well, Governor Faubus at the time was not a big fan of this. And this is what he ended up doing. He called the Arkansas National Guard to block the doorway of the Central High School. Now, this happened for quite some time. For weeks upon weeks upon weeks, these black students could not enter. So finally, President Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time, he had said this to Governor Faubus. Now, did he actually make a phone call and tell him this, that, and the other was going on? Probably not. But this is what ended up happening. Governor Faubus, whether you like it or not, this is the law, and as the president, I have to uphold it. So this is what's going to happen. You're going to let these babies come to Central High School, and to make sure that this happens, I'm going to send my guys or the federal troops to escort them. So these babies had their own personal bodyguard for quite some time, and they ended up integrating the school. But Governor Faubus did not let it go. A year later, he had the public high schools to shut down for a year. Federal government stepped in again. Supreme Court had said, hey, you're still breaking the law. Open those schools back up. Now, again, did they say that exactly? No. But the actions were that the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas had to open up, and they had to integrate with deliberate speed, as in fix this with a quickness. So that's what ended up happening in Little Rock. Now, stuff like this was happening all over the country. Here we are in Montgomery, 2.5 hours from here. So to me, this is very significant. We're integrating, the integration of the public school, the public transit system was about to come about. And it happened in December 1955. Rosa Parks, she was a seamstress at Montgomery Board. She did not give up her seat to a white passenger. Let me back up just a little bit. The law was there was a black section of the bus, and then there was a white section of the bus. Once the white section was full, and if the black section was full, then a black passenger would have to give up their seat. Well, on this particular day, she wasn't going for it. She ended up getting arrested for it. Now, her arrest sparked this bus boycott. People in Montgomery got together, they organized, they formed carpools, they walked, they did everything they possibly could to avoid riding the bus. And this happened for quite some time. It was over a year, actually. It was a successful protest, if you will. So after a year, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was illegal, and the buses became desegregated. If you paid your fare, you could sit in any free seat. So all of this was going on. And again, this is just 2.5 hours from us. So this is incredibly significant to us. So now we have this thing called sit-ins. A sit-in, where you go into an establishment and you sit to protest the discrimination practices of a particular restaurant. This was going on, we're in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 college students did this because they wanted to challenge the desegregation actions in private establishments. So they did this. Now, if you look at this picture, we got ketchup and mustard and salt and sugar and all this other kind of stuff poured onto these students, but they couldn't react. They had to do this nonviolently. But this went on and on for quite some time until finally the restaurants decided to desegregate their lunch counters as well. And this was the formation of, this led rather to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, or SNCC. So I went through that kind of fast, but in summary, civil rights leaders, what they ended up doing, they battled school segregation in court. And the Montgomery bus boycott, 2.5 hours from here, helped end segregation on public transportation. Students organized sit-ins to protest segregation. So all of these things were happening in pockets all around the country. There was this movement that was going on, and people just weren't having it. They knew that America could be much better than what it is. Now, we're at the end of this lesson. Now, the next time you tune in to me next Wednesday, we are going to be going into Kennedy, Johnson, and their actions with civil rights. That's section 2 in chapter 13. I'm also going to do my best to cover rights for other Americans too, like women, people of the Spanish population, people that are disabled, all kinds of groups of people wanting to have their civil rights. And all of this is just to make America better again. Now, change is inevitable. Sometimes it's difficult and it takes courage. Remember, I had said being courageous does not mean you have no fear. It just means that you recognize your fear, but you do what needs to be done anyway. All right, grasshoppers, I need to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for giving me the honor and the privilege to educate you. My name is Ms. Tonetter. I'm at Denton Magnet. Bye-bye, my grasshoppers. Be safe.